Hello. In the second video on Carl Gustav Jung, I want to present a brief summary of his views on personality structure, including his famous type theory, with its distinction between introversion and extroversion. Let me begin with Jung's distinction between different personality types. Jung had already considered the idea of distinctive psychological types during his years of medical work, but it was not until 1913 that he presented them formally at the International Psychoanalytic Congress, which was held that year in Munich. Key here was the distinction between introversion and extroversion. For Jung, these were distinctive attitudes which expressed the direction of outlook and interest of the libido. The libido here being a much more wide-ranging concept than in Freud's work, perhaps similar to Schopenhauer's will to live, or a general life force. In the case of introversion, the individual's life force was directed inwards towards the self. Introverts were therefore those who habitually derived their motivations from inner necessity and were preoccupied with their inner life. They were reflective and thoughtful, and tended to be self-assertive and resistant to outside influences, wanting their own way. By contrast, extroversion expressed the direction of the individual's life force out towards objects and other people, and to relationships with those objects and people. Extroverts were therefore those who habitually derived their motivations from external factors, including social relations. Unlike introverts, extroverts adapted quickly to their environment, paid attention to objects, and were unlikely to be shy. Originally, Jung identified a third intermediate group, the average man, thinking that these were the majority. They were different from both introverts and extroverts. But later he came to see them as a small minority who were fairly equally influenced from within and without. That is, they were able to balance the opposing tendencies towards introversion and extroversion. This was not easy to do, and most people were more inclined towards one or the other pole, even though the extent of their introversion or extroversion might vary. It was the degree of dominance which determined which type they belonged to. Human beings were complicated, however, and sometimes an individual might express the opposite of their normal type, as when an introvert enthusiastically talked about some solitary hobby, like stamp collecting, with no realization that their listeners were bored. Jung later used these categories to explain the difference between Freud and Adler, with Freud portrayed as an extrovert focused on relationship with a sexual object, and Adler as an introvert whose focus was on the subjective individual and the will to power. Jung's own break with Freud could also be better understood by reference to these categories, Jung seeing himself as an introvert. Jung later added a major new element to his type theory with his concept of the four functions. Introversion and extroversion did not stand alone, but were each subject to different ways of interacting with the world, specifically how people gained their knowledge about the life situations they faced, and how they acted in response to those situations. Jung thought that there were two alternatives, each for viewing and for dealing with the world. Thus, the individual could primarily rely on either sensation or intuition in their perception of the world. Sensation transmitted physical stimuli to conscious perception, and intuition transmitted perception unconsciously, as in having a hunch. Similarly, in deciding how to react to specific situations, they could rely on either feeling or sensation. Feeling was subjective, relying on felt value in rejecting or accepting something. Thinking was neutral and logical, seeking to understand the situation conceptually. Combined with the introversion-extroversion polarity, this produced a total of 8 psychological types, 4 each for introverts and for extroverts. Sensation and feeling, sensation and thinking, intuition and feeling, intuition and thinking. Only one perceiving and one judging function could be dominant at a time, as also only introversion or extroversion. It was thus possible to identify individuals on the basis of these 8 types, and so better understand their psychic needs. Jung, for example, saw himself as a thinking, intuitive introvert, this being a good combination for a creative scientist whose work combining abstraction and hunches needed to be checked and elaborated by others. By contrast, a visionary prophet might be an intuitive feeling extrovert, burning with zeal to lead others, but distrustful of logic. In passing, let me note that in decision-making, Jung's concept of feeling was not the same as emotion or mood, these being sensitivities which unsettled judgment. The appearance of emotion, characterized by a measurable physiological reaction, was itself useful in understanding an individual's psyche, indicating as it did a blind spot, normally a defended area, in the individual's unconscious. One idea which became increasingly important, both in Jung's work on personality types and more generally, was that every psychological phenomenon implicitly contained the seeds of its opposite. That is, at the same time as an individual developed a particular dominant way of interacting with the world, a non-dominant, latent way also developed. The individual's type applied to the conscious psyche. A particular type was based on an implicit choice, but the alternative not chosen remained a potential choice which was embedded in the unconscious. Thus, in dreams, the intuitive feeling introvert might act as a thinking extrovert who relied on sensory perception. Indeed, the greater the conscious emphasis was towards one type, the greater the unconscious would be the reverse. As a consequence, to understand an individual's complete nature, it was necessary to understand those tendencies that were latent in them, as well as those that were overtly expressed. Let me now turn to Jung's model of the human psyche. It was complex, and I will only give a basic outline here. First, like Freud's model of id, ego, and superego, it consisted of several elements, but Jung had a different set of components, and even where there was overlap with Freud, gave them different values. At the center of consciousness was the ego. It had a high degree of continuity and identity, and was the seat of the individual's sense of I. Like Freud's ego, it was directive and conscious. Separate from the conscious self was the unconscious. This comprised both the individual's unconscious and Jung's concept of the inherited collective unconscious, which I will discuss in the next video. As in Freud's schema, the personal unconscious could include forgotten experiences from childhood and repressed or sublimated traits, animal-like qualities such as acquisitiveness, aggressiveness, and lustfulness. In addition, however, in keeping with Jung's notion of opposites, the unconscious incorporated the attitudes and functions neglected by the conscious being. The individual unconscious also included what Jung called the shadow. This was the darker self, an inferior animal-like part of the personality, which was rejected by the ego, but remained active through the unconscious, the Mr. Hyde to our conscious Dr. Jekyll, if you will. The shadow wanted to do what we wouldn't normally permit ourselves to do. When it dominated, as it sometimes did, then we said, "Oh, I was not myself." For Jung, it was essential that we recognized this darker element of ourself. He thought that it was quite common for people to ignore it, but this had negative consequences. Not only was a man without awareness of his own shadow not a complete individual, but he was likely to project those things which he rejected in himself onto others, as in xenophobia and racial prejudice. Only by recognizing that not all evil is outside ourselves could the individual withdraw such projections and deal with his or her own shadow. Finally, there was the persona, a term Jung borrowed from the word from the masks used in ancient Greek plays. This was the mask of appearance adopted by the individual in keeping with his or her expected social role, which concealed the private personality behind it. Thus, businessmen were expected to appear energetic, artists unworldly, and so on. It was the outer layer of personality. Another application of the idea of polarity emerged with Jung's concept of psychosexual characteristics. Thus he held that both sexes had unconscious or repressed psychological contrasexual characteristics of the other sex, that is, men have a feminine anima and women a masculine animus. This contrasexual element was the part of the self on which the individual based their relationships with the opposite sex, and such relationships were first expressed through these. Problems developed when the archetypal image of the opposite sex was significantly different from the love object on which it was projected. Adjustment in such a relationship depended on a compromise between the real and the ideal. This complex model was powered, as it were, by the psychic energy of the libido. Jung's concept of the libido was quite different from Freud's. Sexuality was only one of its several manifestations. Rather, it was a general psychic energy that could be expressed at different levels of intensity to varying fields of activity, power, hunger, hatred, religion, or sexuality. It was not a specific instinct. In infancy it was expressed in nutrient terms, later in play and social interaction, and only after puberty in sexual form. Jung rejected what he saw as Freud's dogmatic view on sexuality as the root of psychic life, and this was the most significant factor in leading to the split between them. As to psychotherapy, for Jung, the purpose of psychotherapy was to help the patient to become a whole person. For the individual to lead a contented life and achieve their full potential, it was necessary to achieve the harmonious adjustments of all attitudes and functions of their personality, but this was rarely achieved. Nevertheless, the self sought psychological unity, stability, and equilibrium. For this to happen, the individual had to recognize all aspects of his or her personality through a process of self-realization, which Jung termed individuation. Severe disequilibrium between the components of the personality generated psychological problems. Therapy, therefore, had to aid the release of hidden and stifled potentialities and integrate them into the dominant parts of the individual's personality. There would always be aspects of our personality that we could not adequately determine, however, so we could never completely know ourselves. Thank you for listening.